All right, welcome back. We are Game 3004, this mobile game dev 2 in the winter 2022 semester at George Brown, and it's week 11, part 1 of our broadcast. This is our lecture component. We don't have a lot of time here, but I want to talk about a couple of admin items and then go right into the demo for today. So again, we're sitting from a project perspective, we're still working on our beta release. That's due next week. And then followed by our final release. Between the beta and the final, there's going to be a bit of a play test that's happening in week 13. So that's coming up, where we're talking about memory profiling and testing, as well as making optimizations happen all around week 13 is when that's happening right there. And that's probably the topic of lab 9 is mostly around your profiling and testing and all that stuff. Okay, so that's coming up after your beta. So your beta is super important for you to get going, because if you don't do your beta, then what ends up happening is that you don't have anything to test. Last week, what we did was we did platform detection to remove your on-screen controls. We did that, as well as we provided keyboard input fallback for if you're on a different kind of a platform, if you're on Windows or if you're on WebGL or whatever it's going to be. That's what we did. And we did it again using the application platform detection piece, as opposed to using something like preprocessor commands, okay, because that's another way to do it as well. We converted our project to URP, so it was a little early, and we did it because we needed to do that for VFX graph, and we're going to need to do more of that for shader graph. So next week when we get into shader graph again, that's part of our thing. We're going to do more with shader graph. It's kind of in the reverse order. Maybe what we could do next time, again, when I revamp this course yet again, the next iteration, again, there's some things, some thoughts that I have that I'll probably present to Alex. And one of them is maybe do shader graph a lot earlier than what this is, or even custom shaders in Unity. We'll see how that goes. We installed VFX Graph from the Unity registry. We had some fun with Visual Effects Graph, and I asked you guys to come up with 2 custom effects. Vince was showing us that before we started. And I said you can combine it with a custom shader, let's say from Shader Graph, which was kind of cool. And we know that the VFX Graph right now, because it works on the GPU, that's something we learned. It will not function properly on most mobile phones unless you have, let's say, the Samsung Galaxy S22, if I'm not wrong, the latest version with the 4 cameras and all that stuff. That it has I guess it'd be the flagship phone that the Samsung family has, as well as the Google Pixel. The latest Google Pixel also supports compute shaders. Very nice phones. iPhone 13 and beyond. I think actually even iPhone 12. Was supporting compute shaders as well. So any of those kind of phones, modern phones, will do it. They'll show you those things, and they're pushing the limits of phones as we go forward, because and these are like, again, yeah, you're right, Vince. They're like in the $1,100 to $1,400 range, each of the phones, which is really like having a little computer in your pocket, or which is pretty crazy. It's going to come to the point with a lot of this technology is going to go for even the cheaper phones. Like, for example, they just announced this month, they announced the iPhone SE, which is the latest version, which uses the A15 Bionic chip, if you're an iPhone follower. And the A15 Bionic does support compute shaders, right? So that's something that you can do even with a small phone like an iPhone SE. It would pull off the stuff that you require, because it has the same chipset, which is your ARM processor, the Apple Silicon that they've been working on for the last little while. Okay, so that's the stuff that they've been working with. And I think as the M1 chips and those kind of things that Apple is providing, as they continue to do things like that, or the Snapdragon chips that are used by some of the Android devices, once they become more and more standard and quicker and faster and less expensive, you're going to see that all phones eventually will be able to support compute shaders. So it's good to know VFX Graph and effects on GPUs, things that you've learned in your OpenGL courses, the stuff that you did with DirectX and all that stuff. Those are all going to be usable in the future, especially as we enter the era where a lot of the devices we have in our pocket is just as powerful in many ways as a little laptop that is today, right? Which is coming up really. And if you think about it, think about that the chipset that we have on mobile today. It's a little bit of hardware. As an example, like an iPad. using the M1 Pro as an example. That's pretty crazy if you think about what that is. That's like an iPad that's almost as good in many ways as, and this is how they advertise it from Apple, but almost as good as a lot of, PCs that are out there right now in terms of speed and all that kind of stuff. Is it the same as a discrete GPU? Would I give up my NVIDIA 3070? No, not quite yet. But what about the power profile, which is something that they talk about a lot, and how they compete with Apple competes with PCs and discrete GPUs like that. They're like, wait, we can produce just as much power as, or it's just almost as good as a discrete GPU at like half, the power costs and stuff like this, right? Which is, I think it's something to think about in the future. I think as we keep going with power footprints and how it affects climate change and all that kind of stuff as well, I think we have to start looking at all those things, not just our the stuff we have, but even how you charge your phone. Your phone is charged on your wall, and how does the wall get power and all that kind of stuff, right? So I think these are good concerns for the future. So low power chipsets are going to be the way of the future, and I think we're going to see that there's going to be a lot of great things to come from that kind of thing. I'm also happy that outfits like Apple are competing with Intel, because Intel's architecture has been really non-moving for so long, right? Even AMD, if you think about what they're doing, they're not really pushing the boundaries of the x86 chipset and so on, right? So that the fact they're changing back to a RISC processor, right? And that's what Apple is doing with theirs, is providing it, a low power, high, high use, kind of scenario, which is something that we want to get into. We want to move away from the old architecture, which means some backwards compatibility issues and some short-term pain, but in the future, much faster machines. All right, so that's kind of a little bit of talk about the hardware stuff. In terms of what we're doing this week, so we're talking about some high-level concepting about how to sculpt, model, and all that kind of stuff, retopologizing and rigging. I'm going to go through the process of model creation at a very high level. Again, this is not a 3D modeling course, and this is not an art course, but we do include some assets for game developers in this course. One thing we've been talking about, myself and Alex, we've been talking about how it would be nice if we had a pure course on assets for game developers, where you would spend your time doing a lot of that stuff that we did in this course there. So kind of extract some of the components and have additional ones. Like, so maybe half the course would be 2D and another half would be 3D. And so you have all the assets and everything else that you need for your games that you can create for little indie examples and that kind of stuff. And also for you to understand how assets work, as an example in games. So that's something we want to think about. Texture creation and texture painting, how we do that, and the whole animation process, which is motion, performance capture, all that stuff. So really this part isn't really part of your lab necessarily, but it is part of the lecture piece to bring you up to speed with the lab. So let's start today, with Blender. All right, so there's going to be a piece that's in Blender this week. So again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click on our Blender, and what I want to do is I want to start this as administrators. Please join me with this first. And then we'll get into Mixamo. So back in Blender, we're here. We haven't been here for a while. I told you we're not going to do a lot of this the second half of semester, but this is kind of one where we can kind of do it. So there's two ways of doing organic modeling on the cheap, and I mean that because if you're going to go with something that's professional, let's talk about some of those professional programs out there. One of them is ZBrush. Okay, so we can't discount ZBrush. I think this is kind of the de facto standard for organic modeling and voxel painting. I think this is the way to go. It creates, a different topology for, to create organic models. That's what ZBrush is known for. ZBrush grew up out of a bunch of different, it was kind of an iterative process to create ZBrush, as an example. It didn't come out of nowhere. And a lot of times when they created stuff like this, it became almost like trying to find, which dial, which lever to press among all the hundreds that they added in over the time frame. So really great stuff that they produce with ZBrush. And if you look at the software for for what they've created, which is kind of neat, they have some amazing features that they've done with ZBrush. Everything from creating organic models to things for 3D printing to a lot of stuff. And the way this is done, this is kind of the professional one. The other one that I also recommend is 3D Coat. So that's kind of your cheaper version of what you can do. Again, 3D Coat's really neat. And Pilgray is actually, if you think about this let's just look at this for a second. And I don't normally do this, but they're out of Kiev, Ukraine. And I got to talk about these guys because this is kind of something that is relevant, right? These guys are out there, and I know that they've been talking about how they created this little software. So even out of their what they do, it's amazing what they have to deal with, and they still produce amazing stuff from a little country like Ukraine. Okay, so just kind of putting it out there. But what Pilgray did, and this is the actual thing before the whole fight, with the whole thing with Ukraine and Russia, one thing to know is that they came up with a really cost-effective organic modeling solution that I would say challenges a lot of the stuff that ZBrush does. It's just not, I wouldn't say that it is, the de facto standard. I think it's another way to do it where you can create both organic and as well as hard surface models for games. So to answer your question, Herman, a hard surface model is something like more like a machine or robot, a building, those kind of things that have hard edges, hard surfaces. Organic models are models that normally have things like bones inside of them, and that make you feel like you're looking at an animal or a person or some kind of reticulating item that requires some kind of bones in the middle. I think I kind of look at it from that perspective. So 3D Coat's another program that's out there, and I think it's much more cost effective than, for example, something like ZBrush. ZBrush is way more expensive than this, especially if you get into kind of the lower end stuff. Sometimes they offer stuff online as well for universities and schools where they give you a really great price if you're a student. Okay, so that's something that you can do as well. And it's in euros, but they'll convert it to Canadian as well. It's really great. Student and teachers, what it's like. You can actually use it, and for free. It's pretty good for what they give you. Right, so I think it's pretty good, and you can buy it for a very, very low amount. And look at what it says. It says one year rent. You can rent it out, or you can do with a monthly subscription. It's totally fine for something that's reasonable, right? So I think it's really great. They provide that kind of stuff, and it's and for the advantage of what you look at, it's not bad for what you get. They also provided some of this on Steam. You can buy. You used to be able to buy 3D Coat on Steam as well. So that's the one thing they do. So you make an organic model, and you start off with something like voxel sculpting, which is millions of pieces of data, millions of polygons, and I'm not joking, millions or at least hundreds of thousands. And then what you start doing is you start breaking it down from hundreds of thousands right back down to a low poly model, right? So the way you do it is the process is you make something that's very high poly, you create your texture around the high poly model, which is a whole other process. And then what you do is you create a normal map, and the normal map maps your texture on top of a low poly model. So from high poly to low poly. And you get a very decent amount of detail out of a low poly model. So you start with something that's high poly like this. Okay, so which is again very interesting. All right, so then that's the next part. Then the next part, what you have to do is you have to retopologize, like Vince is saying. And to do that, the de facto standard is called Topogun. So Topogun is the way to go for retopologizing. So you would take a, kind of an organic model that you create in one of those programs, whether it's something like ZBrush or 3D Coat or something else, and then you retopologize. And retopologizing is literally you lay across the model you create a low poly version of the model, and what you do is you kind of create all the quads slowly. You paint all the quads on the model. On top of the high poly model, you paint your own quads, and you create another shell for the model based on your high poly model. So Topogun is one that you can use. 3D Coat has it built in where you can retopologize something, kind of built in. So there's 3D Coat. And retopologizing from that the fact that it's built into 3D Coat is pretty awesome. Again, a lot of models, a lot of software doesn't really use that, but it's kind of interesting that it does that as well. I have to say the Blender does a pretty decent job of doing that as well, right? So yeah, retopologizing by hand is definitely, you can also do it automatically. But the problem with doing it automatically, it creates, sometimes it'll create triangles, and you don't want any triangles when you're doing organic modeling. You want everything to be quads. And so that is, kind of the way to do it. There's some tricks to how to create quads, and there you get into a bit of issues when it comes to that. So that is the process. The process is, again, you start with something high poly, whether you're using ZBrush, or whatever. You use something like Topogun to retopologize, so you can reduce some of the detail down to something that's usable, that's game usable, because millions of pieces of data or high poly is just not practical for a game. It just doesn't make sense, right? So once you've retopologized, then what you do is you create a texture. You texture paint sometimes right on here on the high poly model, and then you save your texture map as an example to apply to your low poly model, right? That's kind of how you do it. You UV unwrap it, and you make sure that the new quads that you're creating, allow you to paint right on the model and everything else, and it looks really great. Okay, so amazing work. Sometimes we also use Substance, Substance Painter and Substance Designer. There's two big ones. Substance Designer is, again, one thing to note is using nodes to procedurally create textures. Okay, it's different than creating shaders. You actually procedurally create textures that you can apply to your models. Sometimes you create textures like skin. Sometimes you create textures like leather or something like that you actually put together on your model. And the reason why you start making textures like this is because, and you can try and get samples from the real world. That's also something that happens. But there's so much noise that comes from the real world when you take an image. It's hard to get a really great image. So using procedural tools like Substance allows us to create textures and modify them on the fly to do a lot of really cool things. So take a look at Substance. It was owned by its own company now, bought by Adobe, and you can create all kinds of stuff that's procedural. So all of this stuff is procedurally done. It's not something that comes from the real world, which is great. Okay, so it gives a lot more options for how to create this stuff. So you have to texture, you have to apply the texture somehow, one way or the other, and this can create everything from normal maps to kind of different kind of roughness maps or metallic or a bunch of other stuff here that's included as well. So really great stuff, and it's quickly becoming the standard again on procedural texture creation. So kind of really great the way this works. So take a look when you have a chance. It's not free, but there are some free trials, and it's node based. So again, visual scripting that you use to connect stuff and to procedurally create a texture, which is pretty awesome. I love this tool. Okay. All right, so that's that one. So what do we do then in Blender? What can we do in Blender that doesn't cost anything? We already have Blender and whatever. And what if I want to do some sculpting in Blender? How do I do it, and how do I proceed? Well, Cube is okay, but the problem with the Cube is it only has a small amount of verts. And if we ever want to do any kind of organic modeling, what we want to try and do is have, especially when we're going to deform a model, as an example in Blender, we want to have more topology as much as possible. We saw that when we were creating things like our, some of the different things we brought into Unity, right? So we did that kind of stuff as well. So we need more topology to bring in. And then what we can do is once we have enough topology, we can, attach bones and all that kind of stuff and everything else, right? So let's start by using a cube. And the first thing we want to do is, again, we want to retopologize, this thing. Well, we want to subdivide this thing. So a couple of things to do is we can start with a cube. A cube is going to be very hard, kind of edges. That's one thing. Good thing about a cube is we can divide it in half for symmetrical modeling, which is what we want to try and do as well. So keeping the symmetry going, which is important when we start doing organic modeling, right? So we could use a cube, but I recommend switching it to a UV sphere instead. So let's do that. So let's get rid of the cube and add in, starting off with a UV sphere. There it is. And what we want to do here with a UV sphere is just like we did before, we want to cut it in half. So we want to remove half of the geometry here. So this is part of just your demo for today. And just like we did last time, I want to remove half of it. So just like this part here on the half. And I want to go in front view. So again, you can go on the side, but I'm going to go in front view to do this. So I'm going to use B select mode. Again, it's been a while since we did Blender, but I'm just going to do this with you now. So B select mode, and what I want to do here is I want to go into edit mode and get rid of half of the geometry, so the left half. So get rid of it, and it'll say I want to get rid of vertices, right? And if you miss something, like if you miss some of the ones in the middle, you can go in the middle and remove them if you need to, but I've got pretty much half of the model gone. Okay, so that's the first thing you want to do. And next, what you want to do is you want to add in a modifier. So we can go in and put a, where I want to add my symmetry in there. So just like we've done before, we want to put the mirror modifier back in. Okay, so we can see the other half. So are you with me? Check mark if you're with me in Blender. We've kind of taken the model, we've subdivided it in half, or kind of cut it in half here. And if I look at it from a, kind of in, by putting the, instead of wireframing the way we had it, if I go back into, I'm in edit mode, but instead of seeing through it, I want to go into solid mode. You can see that I only have control over half the model compared to what I had before. Now, there are some inherent issues here at the top of the UV sphere. Okay, one of the things are, you can clearly see that the edges on top here, or the faces on top here, are all triangles. So things to note, whenever we're doing organic modeling, triangles bad, quads good, right? That's something to think about. So what can we do up here? We have a lot of geometry already. What can we do up here in this top part to either remove the triangles, right, as an example? So that's something we want to do. We want to remove the triangles, and we can reduce them down to some smaller area up here. Well, again, if I press Control R, right, so I want to make a loop cut and slide around here, it's not going to have a lot of possibilities. I can do it here, 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 and so on. No problem. I can add as many cuts here as I want. But the first part I want to take care of is the top and the bottom, right? So the other way to do it, of course, is to select all these vertices on the top with your circle select. So you could do that. I want to select all the vertices on the top here, just verts on the top, right? And once I've selected all the verts on the top, then I could just extrude, right? And what I can do is, if you extrude this way, that's certainly the way you can go. But if you press extrude again, right? And what you want to do is, like, you want to create another layer of this, a bunch of these, kind of in here, closer to where you want to go. Or let's undo those two changes. So let's say I don't extrude. What if I press G? So I want to move them, right? And by the way, if you're getting that tearing, make sure you turn clipping on the right for mirror mode. If I press G, right, you can see that I can move it away for sure. But if I press GG, two Gs, then I move across, right, the circle. So it kind of gets closer and closer to the middle. So I can almost reduce some of this to something that is more reasonable. So normally I can kind of move it out here, and it's moving along the geometry. So until it gets to kind of the very top, right? So let's think about how I can use this, if I go out, how many points do I have? I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 17 vertices, right? And what I want to do is create a pattern. It's almost like I'm creating a pattern where in the middle, I want to have a quad. So how do I do a quad in the middle, right? And then yet create, you know, kind of a pattern of quads, right? That I can break down this fan, because the triangle fan is no good, right? Get rid of every other line, he's saying at the top. Yes, that's the way of doing it. Absolutely. And the reason for that is because they become quads at the end, right? Each of these become quads, and it's better than these triangles. So what Vince is saying is, let's just shift to edges. Then what I can do is I can get rid of each of these edges. Now there's issues around this, Vince, but it's not a bad solution, right? If I take all these edges and if I press X and I want to dissolve edges, then all of a sudden I have this pattern right here, right? And although this pattern may look like they're triangles, they're actually not. Because each of these points here, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 points. There's 4 points in every one of these things in the top, which is kind of neat. So they're all quads now as well. All right, so this is definitely a way of doing that. Want to do the same thing on the bottom when we do the organic modeling before we start subdividing further than where we're getting right now, right? So, and then we'll talk about how to do that. So again, I want to select kind of every other edge that's on the bottom, right? And then delete it. We'll dissolve edges, and so you get these right here on the bottom as well. So you see that we have, again, you know, kind of 1, 2, 3, 4 in the bottom, 4 on the top. And everything now is quads, which is a great way to start, okay? So that's the first part. Now, the thing is, there's not that many, there's not much geometry here, right? So if I select all and I want to subdivide, let's say if I start subdividing now, and if I subdivide once, you get these weird patterns up here, okay? You get these weird patterns up here. But again, what you're looking for when you subdivide is quads, right? So you still have quads everywhere up here too. I don't know if you noticed that. So this is a quad down here, right? You can see that there are quads. So let's go to vertex mode. This is a quad, that's a quad. All of them are quads. Once you've done the conversion up here first, you're good to go with the quads because that's what you're looking for. Otherwise, you know, you get these weird patterns. Now, there are some weirdness. There's some weirdness going on, okay? Like, it looks like a star pattern on the top, right? So that is definitely something you've got to be wary of, especially when you do your UV unwrapping. What are those quads going to look like at the top of the head if this is a person's head, or the bottom, right? A lot of times we want to put, you know, things like the top and the bottom, you know, as an example, in your geometry. You put it to someplace where you cannot see it. You hide it at the top, where something is like not going to be skewed as much. So there's things to note, okay? Let's do it again. So select all, and we'll subdivide again. So we'll say subdivide. Okay, now we have a lot of geometry. I think this is enough for us to start off with, okay? And this is what we want to use to sculpt. Okay, so we want to sculpt the right side, and it's going to be happening on the left side. Let's save our model the way it is. We'll just call this inside of our downloads. I think this is pretty good. And when I say a lot, I mean, there's probably enough for what we're going to do with Blender, okay? It's not really a lot. This, compared to what we do with a voxel sculpting tool, this is still nothing. Okay, remember, millions, not this is just like thousands still. We're in the thousands range. So we're just going to call this, you know, organic.blend. And I'll put this up later on for people who need to use this for the lab later on. Okay, so again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder for today, and this is just week 11, and I'm going to put my stuff in there. Okay, so we can save it in one spot. Okay, great. So now that I have this, I want to go into sculpting mode, right? So here's my sculpting mode. Sculpting mode is right here. You can clearly see that we can still do sculpting on this part here. On the left, there are different tools: draw sharp, clay, and clay strips, and a bunch of other stuff. What I want to do is think about what you can do with the drawing. So if I was to draw, this kind of builds up the geometry on the left and the right. You can see that that's happening. So if I want to draw something like, you know, difference, and I can continue to build up that area by, you know, kind of selecting that area again and again. You can still just see that there's quite a lot of, you know, pixelation there going on. It is, we do have kind of like a voxel-like surface, right? But it's not a lot of geometry. You can see because of the level of detail, all right, that we have here altogether. If I take this back into something like modeling mode, then as you can see, what's happened is the vertices have deformed, but all around quads, which is the way to go. So this is definitely a way to do it. And you can see that I can add surface detail, right? That's here. I'm using W for subdividing, right? And this is neat, but what I probably want to do is let's pull this back down to where it was, and let's add more, because this is not enough, right? So let's go back to modeling mode, and let's add even a further, you know, kind of, you know, more detail, okay? And again, there's going to be some issues around this, but don't worry about it. So I want to subdivide again, and you can see now that we're at another level of detail with like a bunch more quads, all right, that we've created. Again, the stuff to worry about is the things on the top here, but you can see that they're, even these are all quads as well at the top, right? So that's something to note, right? So they're okay, or deformed, but everything here is nicely ordered, which is really great. And again, if I go back into sculpting mode now and I try it again, take a look at this, what I get now when I do it. So I kind of select one side, and I'm getting much finer grain detail than I did before. Still, believe it or not, this is nothing compared to what we can normally get. Now, there are some functions on the side like smooth. So if you look at this one right here, smooth, and if I go over the same surface with a smooth, what it does is it kind of takes away some of the detail. So if I added something like this, which was like, you know, part of the head, as an example, you can see that what smoothing does, depending on the strength of the smooth, so there's different options here. One is the radius and the other one is strength. Sometimes we want to bring that strength right down, because what happens is you can just smooth out the model so it looks better, but it doesn't lose detail. The more smoothing you do, the more detail is lost. Okay, so just letting you know. So let's undo that. And we'll go back to the original. So this is the original. And let's try it again. So let's try that sharp cut this time. So then we did a kind of a cut. I'm just going to put it in front mode so you can see it better. So let's suppose I'm doing an eyebrow ridge or something like that, which is part of the face. So I'm kind of doing this so that you can see how sharp that is compared to what we did before. So again, as I add more detail, it becomes sharper and sharper, and you can see what that does. It actually cuts into the model, right? As opposed to something like, you know, for example, that we did before, where drawing builds up the model. So if I can build the ridge around that area, you can see what that does, right? So I can build the ridge around the area, right? And then I can do the cut that's inside the area. And then what it does is, as an example, I can actually go in there and smooth again, right? Smoothing, be careful with the strength. And again, pull that strength right down. And then what you can do is you can smooth those areas so they look more natural, right? So they don't look as rough and pixelated. Guys, I have to tell you that this is still pretty darn pixelated compared to what we'll be used to. We're going to see all this detail just like these little these things in Unity. So what I will say is, not enough power, my friends, not enough. Let's do that again. So let's undo. And let's subdivide one more time, right? And see if we can get to that. Now, we don't want to go more than this, because the more we subdivide, the crazier it becomes to do. So let's do it again. So subdivide. So I'm going to subdivide it one more time. And you can see now, well, it's hard to really see any of the quads at all, but they're there. So notice that the quads were this big. That's where they started. And now the quads are like really tiny. Great thing is at the top now, there's more of this kind of structure. And what we could have done to reduce a lot of this play that's up here altogether is we could have put that ring right up to the middle, right up here, compared to way over here. Now you can see the top structure that looks like this. Okay, so you know, hindsight being 2020, we're not going to do that right now. Sculpting, back to sculpting again. So let's go to the front view and let's try and do that same thing, where I want to sculpt that eyebrow ridge again. So what I want to do is start with a sharp line. You can also reduce the radius. So you can see that the radius can improve, big, 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 or you can say that the radius can go down. You can also use a pen for this to do this as well, but let's just think of this is the center line. And let's suppose up here, I want to draw an eye, but I want to draw the eyebrow or some kind of ridge first. So I'm kind of draw, a little bit angry, right? And you can see that I'm doing that by, making a very sharp ridge. And then if you look in there and you scroll in, you can see that that is actually cutting into the model. And what I want to do to support that is I want to build it up on the outside to kind of draw that area up here as well as you're pulling it in. So now you can see that there are ridges, but also high points, right, to kind of accentuate this area here altogether, okay? And same thing goes with this. I want to kind of create this, this area for the nose. We can always undo, which is amazing when it comes to things we want to do. So I want to kind of build this area up in the middle, which is where our nose is going to be, and then kind of, continue to create your face the way you want it to be created, all right, if you're going to do this kind of thing. So that's what this does. Again, we can smooth it off. A lot of times what I like to do is we can, increase the size of our brush, all right, again, by moving this brush up higher. And so a higher smoothing brush smooths this entire area. So if I just smooth off, have a low strength, and what it does is it starts to smooth off that area more and more, right? So it's not as severe, and it kind of brings down the pixelated area as much as possible. So again, let's reduce that to right there and increase the strength of that, just to kind of reduce some of those pockets of pixelation that we're getting, okay, as we're going. So you can see this is a process that takes a long time, and we don't have a lot of time because we're running out of time already. So this is kind of the first part of the face. What else can you do? So there are some flatten areas. Flattening is pretty cool. I want to flatten from one side where you want to flatten, and what you do is reduce or remove geometry. So some of this geometry, we see the kind of the areas that are all, kind of that look very geometrical. Trying to think of the right word. Where you have sharp areas here, you can flatten some areas. That's what flattening does. Okay, and we can flatten more in certain places, especially if you want to have things like a chin. You can continue to flatten. You can also increase the strength of this to its destructive. Be careful, right? So it becomes a little bit more pronounced what you're doing with that. And as you continue to iterate, what you're going to do is slowly, you're going to get to the shape that you want. Okay. Again, I'm just going with, some of the things that I've always heard, which is it's never good enough until it is, right? So again, what about this? This is another tool. So this is kind of a fill, right? And a fill, what you want to do is fill reduces detail as well. If I was going to fill in this area, then it's going to take some of this away, right? So it's taking some of this away, this hardness, all right, here, when we kind of create that, that area here, right? So you're kind of creating creases, and slowly you get to where you like to go. So this is a scrape. So scraping, again, it kind of somehow reduces geometry. At the same time, the stronger, the scraping you do and the smaller the radius, then the sharper it becomes when it comes to how you're going to scrape, okay? To kind of almost create these jowls that I'm thinking. And that is the three. So smooth, flatten, fill, and scrape. Those are those. The ones we start off with to build up stuff is draw sharp, clay, which is interesting because what clay does is it kind of pulls it away. It's almost like you're using this as clay. You're actually building up areas, but you're building it up as almost like parts of the face, right? You can do it so that it looks almost like a little alien head here, like this, or almost like a pumpkin in some ways. But what you're doing is you're literally scraping with clay as you go through here. So it's kind of interesting the way this works. You can continue with the lines, almost like, he's got, kind of this alien looking head that's happening here. There we go. Okay, so kind of that way. Maybe a guy with a beard. right? There we go. So kind of interesting. And then what you have is you have clay strips. Now this is, I would recommend, be careful with this because it can be, if I'm not wrong, really, really destructive in terms of how that looks. That may not be the thing that you want. If you're going to do that, let's undo that. You can reduce the strength a lot. And what this does is it can create areas that are more geometric to create that effect that you're looking for, you know, kind of in your organic model. Okay, so kind of getting stronger and stronger. Clay thumb. Okay, that's like you're pushing, right? So you're kind of like, you know, pushing down or building up, you know, kind of in there, right? So if I want to make an ear area or something like that, I'm not sure if I like that a lot, but let's see how this looks. Let's say I want to build kind of like this, you know, area where the ear could be, right? You can kind of pull it in there so it kind of looks the way you want it to, slowly, slowly. Let's explore all of them. Layer, where I want to kind of layer on top of what I'm doing. That's kind of wrong. That's not what I wanted. Maybe in the middle, I want to layer some stuff for the chin, right? Maybe add, what you're doing is you're adding or extruding the geometry to kind of create that, you know, kind of a beard or whatever. And again, what I would do is probably go immediately back to smoothing, and I would smooth that whole area as much out as possible without breaking it, because you're going to get those, you know, areas that doesn't make any sense. So we can start creating that area. Again, this is kind of, like I said, an iterative process as you move forward, right? So that is layering. Inflate. Okay, so this inflating area, I want to make this area kind of built up a little bit more, and you can see how you can take the existing area and increase it in size where you're building up that area more and more and more, right? Go. And maybe even, let's say, in the middle. So I want to kind of make that nose even more pronounced. You can make it a much wider radius to do the whole face, or I want to kind of target that whole area to kind of push it out even more, right? And you can do that. I'm not sure if I like that, so I'm just going to do those changes. Yeah, but maybe the nose. I like the nose a lot, so reduce that radius down and increase the strength, right? So that way you can get right into that nose area and kind of pull it out the way you want it to, right? The great thing is that if you press Control, now there's also a lot of tearing. See that tearing that happened there? If you press Control, it's the opposite. Okay, so usually a lot of times what you can do is you can, if you press Control, you can kind of press that area in, you know, and reduce some of that stuff as well. So if you want to press it in, especially things like that area in the back, you want to press it in, you know, so you want to make it more flat, whatever, you can do that as you move forward. And if you have these issues like this, where you can fill it in, right? So you go back to fill, right? And you can kind of go in there and fill that area in there as much as possible. Now I messed it up because this actually created a hole in my architecture here. So this is the bad thing that I've done, but you can kind of fill in some of these pieces until that is gone. You can also build it up, so you can build out that area again, but you're always going to have that that kind of hole right there until you have these weird ears or horns, right? So you can kind of build up that area. And same thing with the radius. If I wanted to make, so like, you know, the head bigger, or if I wanted to use Control and push it in, you can push that area flatter on the back or on the bottom. So you can do that. And if it's tearing like this, it's okay. I mean, again, we can fix it, but more or less you get the idea, right? Until you get the shape you want. What about these ones? So we did these ones. These ones do, so blob, again, if I reduce the radius for blob a little bit, it kind of increases the area that you want, right? So kind of like almost a character from you know, a children's animation, right? Where I want to kind of make the chin go up and whatever. And then I want to make that sharp crease for the mouth area. That's right there, right? right? Something like that. And then you go back and you fix it up. So that's how you do the organic modeling. You fix it up. And then if you take it back into modeling, you can see that you've got still thousands upon thousands of these subdivisions. And to try and bring something like this into Unity, you need to retopologize it. You need to retopo it, okay? All right, so that is just the basic process when you're doing sculpting. Painting, you can paint right on there, right? So you can actually texture paint on our model. So once we have our model, we can paint onto it as well. So if I go into texture painting mode, then again, what you want to do is your brush is an important piece. So that's how big your radius is. You want to kind of reduce that right down. And what you're doing is you're actually painting on here on top of the texture. Now, the thing is you need to create a texture first, right? Because you want to make a new texture. Let's call this the head, right? The head texture, right? So let's say press OK. And what you're doing is you're kind of spraying on top of the head, this part here, kind of the stuff that you want to do, you know, with the image. So notice if I can literally paint on here, right? So I can paint on this. This is actually my my object, and it's going to appear here when I add it in. Now, the reason why it looks all like this is because this texture, if you remember the material, right? There's no material that's been applied to this whole thing. So let's do this. Let's do this. Let's add a material. So here's my material. Let's call this the head material. Head material. There it is. And then underneath that, you can see that there's no texture. We can add a texture slot, and we can select a texture that we have right in here as well. So here's our texture. We're gonna call it the head texture. There's the head texture. And then just like before, what we want to do is we want to start, we want to paint on this thing. So when we paint on this, right, as an example, then it'll start appearing on the texture itself. So notice that as I, kind of let's just use a different color so we can see that. As instead of mixing, let's just use add, so additive. So what I want to do is as I paint on here, right, and the strength is like 100% too, which is crazy. As I paint on here, what I want it to do is start to affect this object here, right? And remember, so my model, right, which we have, remember we can only paint on one half of it because we only have control over half it. It's mirrored, so anything we do on one side happens on the other side to some degree. And we can see that the head model, if I go back to layout for a second, here's my head model. And I can look at the material. There's my head material, and here's my texture. And here's my texture. As I'm starting to create it, that texture is going to be applied to the material, right? So one thing to note is where is it being applied, right? So remember, because the material wraps around the entire model, right? That's what's happening here. And from a UV editing perspective, you can see how dense the UVs are. They're really super dense because we're only taking care of this part of the model, right? So that's where the UVs are. And it's kind of interesting, if I look at the head texture, you can start looking at where on the model they are. So you can see how when we're painting on them, you're actually affecting some of these things. It's pretty small, right? You can hardly see them, how dense it is, right? And that's the issue. The issue is when you start painting, it becomes, something that you're going to, painting a model like this will create a map that we can reuse, and when we topologize and put it back, right? So again, let's go back to texture painting for a second. And again, you can see how the model is laid out, right? Where each of the objects are here. Again, if you look on the left, you can draw, you can soften, right? So draw is what you want to do. The radius is pretty big. You can reduce it even smaller in size. The strength is high. This is the color that you can choose. And then as you're starting to paint, on parts of the model, right, to affect parts of the model to paint with, right, you can see that you're adding more and more details of blue, let's say, to the model. But the thing is, where is that blue coming out, and how come we can't see it on the model, right? Because the model should also show the same thing. If we were going to do texture painting, and notice that, again, we're we're targeting the head texture, right, as an example. Remember this? Then it's the same thing when it comes to where the color is. The base color hasn't been affected. Let's use the image texture that we're going to use. And the image texture we want to just look at is the head texture. So this is the head texture. Now you can see that what we were doing is actually starting to kind of pull up. And if I literally draw on here, right, on the head texture, you can see how it's starting to, kind of affect the stuff that I'm looking at. That's text draw. And it's not great because of the, it's not great compared to what we would expect, because typically, you'd want kind of a clear, way of doing this. And we're not getting a lot of, kind of painting over the model, because at the end of the day, the way that the model has been designed is pretty poor. Lots and lots of geometry, and it takes a long time, lots of power for me to do even something like this. Maybe your model is turning out better than mine, but mine is taking a hell of a long time just to put a little bit of texture on the areas that I'm affecting. Okay. One thing to also note is that so it depends on how you're painting, right? So one thing is I want to use accumulate. If I use accumulate, that if I hold it down, it's going to put more and more color the more I'm holding it. So if I accumulate it across different values, it's going to continue to add more and more color there into this alien head that we have, right? You can also try and do one of these where you want to start, you can start over by selecting the fill. Let's say, for example, I wanted a default color to start off with, which is more of a gray color or a black color, right, on different parts. You can also have multiple textures that you want to apply as well and split this texture up into different islands. So why is this difficult to do? Because we have so much topology. We have so much topology, and it's so slow to paint. And so, again, Blender, nice, but it takes a lot of effort to do the same thing. So again, if I was to paint this, and let's say change to blue, you can see that it takes a lot of effort to do this kind of stuff. Really a lot of effort, where you don't have a lot of effect based on the general color. Again, this is additive, right? If I want to darken, that's just another effect. Where I want to darken that area, there you can see that that is happening there. And I can darken those spots, right? So you can kind of create those areas there where I want to darken. Okay. And you can see that there's a bit of a pattern that's emerging, right? Where is that pattern coming from? Well, there is no real texture, right? That texture doesn't exist. So what I'm doing is I'm literally drawing on the model like this as well. So that's kind of where the model is starting. That's the darken. Let's take a look at multiply. Again, another kind of darken, right? And we can also start with a texture and modify that texture. So let's say, for example, the head texture is what I'm looking at. But let's say I want to start with a texture. I can open one up here where I want to open an image that I can work with. Let's say, for example, I wanted to look at that brick texture that we were using before, right? So let's do that. So we'll say like that gravel cobble texture. We can look at that as something that we want to modify. So we start with this, and then I can apply that model to the texture that texture to the model instead. So instead of like the head texture, we can look at that gravel cobble texture, this one, right? So that's the one I want. And so that way we can, we want to apply this texture, right, as opposed to the other one that we had before. So that is the one that's being applied now, the gravel cobble. But so then why then does it look like this? Well, again, one thing that we want to do is we want to, I know, isn't it funny? It's pretty funny the way there's that gravel part, right? So there's, see that gravel part coming through? And we can actually start, kind of creating almost a model with more, kind of this, geometry that looks fairly close to what we want to do. So it has that almost like gravelly looking area there with the blue, right? Again, not the best tools, I would say. That's why Blender's okay, for what it does. But I'll tell you right now, if I was going to do this with 3D Coat or ZBrush, the workflow is totally better than this for Blender. Not that you can't do it with Blender and everything else, you can. Like for example, if I started off with this gravel cobble texture, you can see what it does. Now notice this part here, it kind of cleans up some of these areas that we didn't see before, but you can also see that there's areas here that are not cleaned up because they haven't been sculpted properly, especially this part in the middle, which is actually being mirrored, right? So that's something that's happening there. Pretty ugly guy, right? As an example, but this is the idea. So the idea is here, when you start off, you model, and then from there you texture paint, and what it does is it creates a texture that is being shown, that is going to be kind of something that you're using inside of the object itself. So if I scroll in, you're going to see that there's parts of the texture that I can literally darken, right? And I can kind of create areas there that are going to have, kind of darker areas and lighter areas. The problem with it is it's just so compact, the stuff that we're doing, that you can actually see what the texture looks like here, right? So kind of the way it looks. Right? So this is the original model. That's the one that's shaded, and we can see what it looks like with light. Okay. If I go back out to the layout mode, you can see that it's like that. Exactly. And what if I wanted to start from scratch? I didn't like that texture, no problem. So we can just go back and we can remove that texture altogether, right? And then when it comes to the texture slot, so we can just, kind of remove that texture slot altogether from the model, okay? Or just remove the material. So the material's gone, start with a brand new one. There's nothing wrong with it. And the thing is, you know what? We'll call this head 2. Head 2, just to give you a sense of that. And I know we're running over time, guys, but we can add in, we already have a texture slot, and let's just add in that gravel cobble texture. As an example, there's that gravel cobble texture, and save, right? Now, one thing to note is when you save, that original gravel cobble texture is, see you later, it's bye-bye, right? And then, so that's what this is. And if I go back to here, right, my base color will use an image texture. And now you can see that we can decide which image texture to use. I want to use that, head 2, or the gravel. I can use gravel cobble if I want to. There's my gravel cobble. And you can see that those lines that I drew, right, are the lines that I put on the gravel. So notice that the texture looks like this. I made these lines, right? And that's what it looks like here. Right? So that's how it kind of look with the lines that I've drawn. And you can see that there's some issues down the bottom, and there's some issues on the top. And those issues are the way that we've unwrapped the model as we've created it slowly. Okay. That's your so your texture painting is here, and like you see, this is the part of the model that I'm painting. One thing I could also do is remember that in my UV map, if I go to my UV editing mode, and you can see that it's quite dense, the UV editing mode. I can also look at the gravel cobble texture, and if I select all this and we scale it out, we can see that the gravel cobble texture will get either bigger or smaller. So take a look when I do that. It's just similar to what we did before, where we have a much smaller version of this. And UV unwrapping is like another part of this whole thing. You can see that it starts layering, right? Some of the stuff I'm doing here. So if I draw on here, then it creates the same layering effect on here, right? So you can kind of have a pattern when you're drawing on this thing, and how it looks as we're kind of, reducing some of this stuff here, right? So maybe kind of a different thing, a different shape that we want to create that's repeating, okay? So that's what this does, right? When we change the UVs around, right? So going back to UVs, right? There we go. If I go the other way around, so I kind of select that and move smaller, and let's just turn on the map so we can see what it looks like. So we can clearly see, the great thing is we can see it on this side, even though this side is the one that's on. So we can scale it up or scale it down. This is scaling it down, this is scaling it up. And as you move closer and closer to this size of the pattern, you can see that it has a direct effect, right? As we move closer, it has a direct effect on what this looks like, right? So again, we move right in, right? And you can see what we've drawn here is directly affected by what we've drawn over here. So if I go back to my texture painting, then if I was to paint on the model now, we're seeing that there's more of a direct effect on the model compared to what we saw before. So there's this part. Okay. And it's kind of layering kind of the stuff that we had before. So you can see that that's how it works. I can change the colors. So I'm just using dark, and I'm using also a multiply, which is a darken. You can also use a mix, so that kind of mixes in with the current colors that we have, right? And with the UV map. Okay. So that's what it does. That's what it does there. If I look forward, you can actually see that that's been done. And those are the pixels that have been used along the areas that I've colored, right? Based on the UV map that I've got in here. So again, if I change that color, if I change it from mix, to a lighten, right? So there's that as well. You can see that what that does kind of removes some of the detail in some ways from the darker colors and lightens it up with more green. That's lighten. And this is the same, these are the same modifications that we have with from Photoshop. Screen it's kind of more of a mix, where it kind of mixes in the stuff that I have, right? That's what screen does. It's kind of a layer that's on top of everything else, but it continues to lighten, right? And let's make his eyes red. And we'll make the size of the brush even smaller. So you can see that here, you can kind of do whatever you want for some of this thing. It's kind of a neat way of looking at it. And this is what the actual texture map looks like when you're layering this on, as an example from this thing. It's like really wacky looking thing that we've made, but that's okay. Again, it's all part of the exploration of the stuff that we've looked at so far. Vince is going to show me a picture. Let's see, Vince, what you made. Cool. Love it. Right? with the gravel cobble. Oh, that, okay, yeah. So again, so what I'm doing is, so we have the brush is a texture, right? That's the brush, right? But you can see that I don't want to, I don't have to accumulate. Accumulating just removes. Accumulate actually adds stuff. So whatever I added into the texture is something that's going to be shared everywhere else. That's why when I turn from brush to accumulate, whereas the effect alpha is what it's done. It's kind of reducing the alpha transparency. I can also remove, like delete stuff. And there's also stamp. So take a look on the left here. There's a lot of stuff. So again, if you ever want to start from scratch, we can always just fill. So if I go fill, you can fill the entire area up with, kind of this pattern. And if we don't like it, again, there's nothing wrong ever. If you don't like the result, you can always go with a brand new texture. You can say, oh, I want a new one, right? And you can do that, no problem. So here, I'm starting with a brand new image. So the image is actually created for you. You can make it, by the way, you can change the image size. Right now, by default, it's a 1K texture. You can go with a higher level texture if you want later on. So this is this stuff. Let's suppose I want to go with the texture that is my, call it big head, right? And it's using alpha. And the generated type, you can see the generated type is blank, but you can also have other options as well. Let's just do blank, and let's press OK. So now we have this big head texture. It's blank. It doesn't show up here because, again, our model is using gravel cobble, right? So we can kind of say, I want to use the big head texture. There it is. You can see that that's blank, right? And it's all shiny and stuff like that because the way that the kind of things are working. And again, once I have this texture, I can go back to painting it the same way we did before, right? So we can make the brush's radius bigger, right, as an example. And we want to go with the brush. And then let's say we want to, let's change the radius to smaller. So we start with a black color like this because it starts off as black. And this is the area that it's going to be affected. You see the UVs are, quite small. But if I want to lighten, again, think about what you're doing, right? These are the mixing. You're mixing kind of colors together to get to what you're doing. And you can see that if I want to color something, that's another option. And let's say I want to go with something else like that. And as I start to affect the object, right? I want to do my affecting here, and it's going to affect the object there. How much strength is it going to have, and what is it going to do? If I put back on accumulate for a second, right? And let's just look closer to this thing. If I want to go with I'm using color. Let's go with a lighten. Let's go with, yeah, that's better. Okay, so let's undo that. So let's take off the accumulate for a second, and let's just go with a lighten. You can see that you can start, kind of layering what this looks like. So the top. And where are we getting this extra colors? Well, because what it's doing is it's using on the principal BSDF, it's using the big head. That's what it's doing, right? But the texture is using is gravel cobble. So you can change that, of course, to big head. And that's what it's actually showing here, right? So that's the one you want, right? And you can change your big head texture to whatever it's going to do. It actually saves it for you as you start off. Kind of a neat way of doing it, right? So, and so that's, be kind of careful on what you're doing here, because that's what it's actually doing. So there's two parts. There's the texture slot itself, right? And you're using image or movie, right? That's what you're doing. So image or movie is actually selecting the texture. This is the preview of the texture that you're going to get. And you can select the texture that you're working on. So this is big head. So you can see that is actually going to show up as something that's going to be here. And you can see where that texture is being shown up here on the model. All right. We're not going to continue. I just wanted to show you what it looks like. We made a mess, right? And we're just fooling around with this thing. Again, some of the things to think about when we're creating this, and let me just go from a texture for a second. So there's texture mask, and there's the fall off. Let me just go to this part. So it says texture slots, right? Big head. That's the one that I want, and I can say it's a material. It's going to material mode. There's a lot of options here, to kind of change the stroke in terms of if I'm using space, dots, airbrush, which is kind of neat, where you can actually spray like an airbrush, like on the actual model itself, and what that looks like. So you can decide on the stroke that you want. So I want to do a line. I can do a line, and it'll actually draw a line, as much as it can. And maybe what I'll do is I'm just going to make a new model for a second. Sorry, guys. I'm just going to make a new model just for a second. So don't worry about this. But let's suppose I want to paint on this cube, right? And if I go to UV editing and I unwrap it, so it's already unwrapped. And if I want to go to texture painting, notice that there is no texture that's been created. So the process is I go to new, I name it something like, let's say cube texture, let's suppose, right? Once I name it, it starts with the base color. So there's the black that we had before. That's okay. So this is just some of the stuff. You press OK. It creates the texture, but it's not applied. And what we would do is we would go to we want to add a texture slot. This is the process. We select it, the texture that we want. So image or movie. And down here, we select it. So cube texture. And although we've loaded the texture slot, we have to apply it to where the model is going to be. So in the base color area, we go to image or movie, right? Or image texture. And then we select the texture that we want, which is the cube texture. And so this is the way it would start, okay? I'm just pointing this out there too, because this is how it would work out to be. Now there's a lot less geometry here, but I'm doing this so you can see what this looks like. So now if I paint, And let's say if I go with a color like white, it's going to be very, now this is a mix. So mix, what it does is, now notice that I'm not getting any results. So why is that? So first thing is, what happens when I go like this? You can see that the whole model turns to white. So that's one thing. And that's a fill, okay? But if I was to, scrape it, you're not getting anything, right? So why can't I do this now in the cube? I've got the brush, right, as an example, and I'm using this, it's tiled. And what about here? One test to do it is, if you can't paint here, you won't be able to paint there. That's the thing to notice as well. Even though the strength is like 100%, it doesn't matter. If you don't see your painting happening here, you're not going to see your painting happening there because we're mixing. But if I change this to something like add is different. Add will add color to this whole area as well, okay? The other option would be, instead of the cube texture, let's go, notice whenever you make a brand new texture, you start off with the title, if it's blank, and the color, right? Remember that you can always go with an alpha of nothing. So it starts off with no texture whatsoever, and now you're painting on top of it. So like kind of a alpha transparency of 0, right? Let's try cube 2. So I know we're running over time, guys. Let's try cube 2 and press OK. And now there's nothing there. And when I add stuff, then we want to add to the texture. So let's make sure that we can do it here first. So that's add, right? And again, you can see that I can subtract, right? And I can add color, right? And all that kind of stuff as well. So those are the things that we want. We want to be able to affect this area here altogether with whatever we're doing. And you can see clearly like nothing's happening, right? That is this thing right here, okay? So nothing here, nothing there. That's what I'm saying. So how can we get this to happen here? Well, if I was to go here and do that, the reason why you're not seeing it is because we're using a new texture called cube 2. And if I was to change that, let's change it to cube 2, then clearly you see the changes right here, right? And if I was to try and draw on here, let's say I drew another color like a green, well, you can see that the color is not happening. Like we said before, radius is low, right? And we're not seeing the color happen. So what can you do? What can you do to make this happen? What did we do wrong compared to what we did before? Actually, everything was wrong so far, but don't worry about it. Well, we did accumulate, so that's something that we did. Accumulate came on. That's the brush type we use, right? Again, the texture slot, it's the cube texture. Let's get the cube 2. That's one thing we want to use. That's the texture slot we're using. So texture slot has to be the same. And now we can start drawing, right? So the texture slot and this has to be the same. I'm using color, right, as an example. And you can see as I kind of choose the color here, then it becomes on the color there. This is the way to do it. So, as an example, if you want to paint on the actual object in 3D, this is what's happening here. So I'm just painting this in 3D. And you can see that that is that face, right? This face right here. And you can change the radius. And you can change the color. I'm going to change it to something else like red. And then you can kind of see what that looks like. But look what's happening now, where I'm getting a blend of the color. So I'm getting a blend of both this one and this one. Why? Because of my accumulate. Let's undo those changes. Okay, and if I take away that and take accumulate off and I do it again, well, too late. Because that's what's happening. It's taking the original color and it's kind of compositing it at the same time. It creates almost like a texture brush that you're doing all together, okay? And again, this is where, it's not as intuitive as the other programs we've seen before. So that's how they do it. They take an object and they might draw it in 3D and it draws right onto your object here. So even if I was to draw it here, you can see that whether I draw it on this one or whether I draw it on the other one, that each of these cubes are going to have it drawn on each of the faces in real time, right? So these are representative. Let's draw different colors. Let's say that we're going to draw blue on this side here. Here's blue, right? There's blue. And let's say on the bottom, we'll do another color just to show you which one it is. So let's say we'll make it really red on this one here. And you can see how it's accumulating the pattern, right? So it's keeping that pattern. That's this color here. And you can see it, the pattern is over here, what it looks like. So that is the texture, right? And what it's doing is it's saving to the texture at the same time that it's outputting, to our base color. Okay, and if we don't want to repeat, we don't have to repeat it. We can do a bunch of stuff here, but that's kind of what the effect is looking like. Other ways of doing this is doing it in Photoshop. So you do it in Photoshop or another program. You import it in here as a base, and then you start messing with the Photoshop. You can also output. This is kind of interesting as well, where you can extract or save your texture map, as an example, out to Photoshop with all the islands, with all of these, kind of like your actual output here, right? So I think there's an option, if I'm not mistaken, where you can save, you can save the object, like all the islands. You can save all those islands so that it comes out with shapes. So it actually gives you the shape of the texture out, and you can use it. You can edit externally, like we've done before, and then you can save it and put it back, right? So you don't have to do it here in in Blender. You can do it in Photoshop or something else and bring it back in. Okay, so that's kind of some ways you can do stuff. And again, you can always, if you ever get confused or if you don't like it, we can always go back and add another material and try again. You can totally do that. And you can also use a different a texture, because the texture is linked to whatever material you're using. So we can remove the texture, right, altogether. So we don't have to use that. And then what we can do is we can go into here, and I can create a new texture here, which is something that we can always do. So remember, there's always a way of creating a new texture. We'll just call this another cube. And once we've created this texture and the generated type is blank, right? You can also make a UV grid if you want to. What does a UV grid look like? Like this. So you can see this is kind of neat because it tells you what the UVs look like. This is a great way of adjusting your UVs based on the grid. So we can go with base color, we can adjust the image texture again, and we can select that another cube thing, which you can see that now that you have that UV grid. You want to see this. If you're in a UV grid, the great checker pattern is it shows you that there's, it's nice and even, and this is what we want from our UV, right? Our UV map. But again, if I was going to draw with color, you can see now that I'm just overlaying on top of the UV. You can see where that pattern is in the actual map itself, right? As we're doing it. So this is kind of a neat way of doing it too. And then now, because I don't have a texture slot that I'm looking at, I can kind of look at texture slot 0, right? That's what this is. And if I was to go back to another cube again, right, you can see what's happening where I'm adding in that image, as an example to the UV map. This is it. Okay. So I'm just layering on top of that. That's what I'm doing. I'm kind of drawing on top of these things. If I wanted to darken, or that's a color, if I want to mix, you can see what's happening is I'm actually getting that as my brush now. So now what's happening is because I've turned this on, I'm using this as my actual brush. So I get a texture brush that's happening here from the stuff that we did before. So you can see that that is going on there. Right? That is our pattern. Kind of a neat thing. That's mixing. Darkening, just to show you on this side, let's darken this part. So you can see what that looks like when we're done. Notice that it's not showing up until we're completely done. And then there it is. Look at that one. That's darkening. So we actually modify the original in the background. And then let's talk about adding. So let's see what adding does. So adding, where you kind of lighten in many ways it's kind of, adding up the colors together. So you're taking basically, the color theory works like this. You get whatever the base color is, and then you're adding the color on top of that. Okay, so kind of a neat thing. And these are all the effects that you can do here. Color burn will darken the crap out of it, right? So that kind of is a burn, right? You can see the checker pattern come into play. All right, that's enough with textures. So why am I showing you this? Because when we have an organic model, remember we talked about this is the process, right? So this is a bit of practice for you guys to get an understanding of how the model is being created. When we get back on Thursday, I'm going to give you a model that is, it's going to be in your assets, and it's not going to have an armature whatsoever. And we're going to take it inside of Mixamo. We're gonna wrap it up, and we're going to use that model to replace your robot, the robot that we have right now in the scene, which looks like a very weird model. Vince's robot looks pretty good. My robot, not so good, right? But we're going to bring that model in. We're going to use that. And what we're going to do with that model when we bring it in is we're going to use some, paint some areas of the model including the texture that we already have. We're going to modify the texture color so that we're going to see what we can do with it. We can actually do a little bit of organic modeling with an existing model as opposed to trying doing it on our own. Again, if you're not an artist, it can be a real challenge the way it works, how it works out. Okay. So it's a bit of practice to get you guys just into the flow of things and how this works and how texture painting can kind of work out. But remember, what we've been doing is if I have a texture slot as I'm accumulating the model, take a look. As soon as I turn off that texture slot, right, how I don't have access anymore to paint. See that? But once I turn on that texture slot again, then we're back to painting again. Okay. So that's something to note. Make sense? All right, we'll get back into this again later on as we continue to paint. Any questions before we go for the day? It's not part of your lab. Yeah.
Yeah, so you do need a texture in the side window in order to operate on a.
Yeah.
Well, you do need to input the texture first, and then you have to go into your texture mask, or at least like.
So let's take a look. So here's your model again, right? As an example, let's use another model. So I'm still recording. So let's use another model like a a UV sphere, right? With no modifications, as is. Okay. And then what you want to go is, again, if I just was to go to my UV, my texture painting shows a bunch of UVs like this. The UVs are already laid out for us by default. Okay. And then what I want to do is inside there, I want to create a brand new texture. So let's make a brand new texture. This is almost like an image that we're creating at 1024 by 1024. And we'll call it like our sphere texture, whatever. That's the first, this is the steps. The color that you see here is the base color. So it's going to start off with whatever base color you give it here. Example, you can give it a black. You can also say the generated type. This is kind of almost like a procedural texture that you're making. You can choose what you want. The UV grid was what we had. A color grid gives us a color grid. Blank is where you want to go. Okay, so blank. Okay. Alpha is with an alpha channel. If you don't turn this on, there's no alpha channel. It means you can't blend. Okay, so be careful about that. Then don't want to if you make it tiled, then whatever you do on one side will tile with the other side. So you don't want to necessarily make it tiled. Then press OK. So the first thing is you make your texture. And this is where you're going to be drawing. Okay. Now next is if I was to draw in this, you can see that works, right? Because this is the texture that I'm drawing on, right? Okay, so that's the first thing. But we want to apply this texture to this model. This model has nothing on it right now, right? So again, if I was to go to the material, there's no material. Let's add a material in. We can choose the default material. So that's the first thing. And let's also make it so we can see it, the material. This is what it looks like right now. But there's no texture. We want to add a texture to the base color. So we're going to go to choose an image texture, right, as an example. And then we can choose the image texture we want, which is our sphere texture, right? And now we have our sphere texture applied to this model. okay, by default. This is just as if we created our own texture. Now, if I was to paint here, we're going to see it here, right away, because whatever we paint here is a one-to-one kind of connection with what we see here. Let's undo that. And if I was to go to the sphere model and paint, let's say, for example, I do one of those, right? You can see that we can paint whatever we want on the sphere model, right? And this is going to appear one-to-one on our UV map. Okay.
I don't want you to end up repeating yourself if you were just returning steps, but I essentially get the gist of it. So.
Yeah, no, that's the idea. So you basically paint whatever you want, and then once you paint it on your 3D model, then what you can do is you can use different brushes, right? So or strengths. Like right now, my strength is 10, right? So if you wanted to mix, let's undo that change. And let's say, for example, I didn't want to make my strength 10. I want to bring my strength down to 0.2, right? So now, because I'm mixing, how much of a mix is it going to be? Much better. Look at that, right? Where it kind of mixes in with what I had. So whatever I had mixes into the model. So you can see that that part of the model is being changed. Once we have that, we can save our texture that we've just created, and we can load it into Unity. We can apply the texture to our model, just like that. So we can do whatever texture we want. Instead of loading a texture, we can create a texture that makes sense for the model itself, for whatever that is, right? So, if you want to make an eye, for the texture, and let's say suppose my eye is going to be here, you make it kind of this area here, and then you can add in kind of a darker color. You can do a color burn or whatever. You can drop the color down because this is kind of something like this. Just drop it all the way down. You can change the UVs as well, but you can see that I can kind of put that in there. You can make it so that the strength is 100%, right? Which kind of takes away that part there, and you can see what that looks like. And then the reason why it's so shiny is because of our options over here on the right, because we've made it very specular, right? And we've added a lot of sheen, and there's index of refraction is up or whatever, and our roughness, we can make it more rough, so you can kind of make it as whatever you like to make it with, and you can just change the color as you go. This is mixing, but you can change the color to whatever color you want. Let's make it a red eye, right? So there we go. And we can see that that looks like that. And maybe at the bottom, we'll make it a kind of orange color. So, and then you can do whatever you want, right? Once you've done this, again, it's pretty artistic. It's like drawing, like anything else you have. This is what's going to appear this is what the texture is going to look up, this texture map. So when you save this is the next part of the process, right? So it's open, this is new, right? And what you want to do is you want to eventually save it. So you go to image, and you can save as whatever image you want. So if I was to do that, let's say save that image as sphere texture.png, right? This is one thing you can do. Then now it's outside of Blender, I can literally just open it up anywhere I want. So you can play with that sphere texture and anything you want to do. Take a look. So here it is inside of a drawing program, and you can also do the drawing here and bring it back into Unity. So if I wanted to change, or Unity to Blender. So let's say, for example, I wanted to have a sharper image that I can't draw with Blender, but I have an idea of where this is. Then the other process is that you can, let's say I want to draw a sphere in there. So that's something that looks like this, right? So really a sharp, thing like that, where it's got more of a, and maybe we'll make it so it's like 5. Just to give you an example how this is, Vince. Right, so this is something like this. You want to kind of have something that's very, very sharp like this, or whatever. You can't possibly do something like this. It's very hard to do this in Blender, right? So what you do is you save this thing, you save the image, right? And then when you go back to Blender, it's not loaded. What you need to do is you have to load it back in again. So what you do is you reload the image, and now it has that thing that you just made.
Yeah, I see it. Okay. Yeah. All right, I think I get it now.
Yeah, so it's a pretty good workflow. I mean, I think it's not impossible. And again, the tools on the top here are all the same tools we would see in Photoshop. Darken, multiply, color burn, all these things. They're just mixing tools, right? Yeah. So if I wanted to lighten, whatever. Let's see how that combines, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Alrighty.
Okay, man. That's it for me. Hopefully that makes sense for you.
Yeah.
Okay, and then hopefully we'll see each other on Thursday, and we'll do an actual thing with an object that I'm going to give you guys.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks a lot. Take care. Thank you, everybody,
Okay.
for paying attention and coming over. Thanks, guys.
Later. Bye.
Take care.